Time doesn't stop. But what if the legends of history never left us? Have you ever wondered how old they'd be today? Imagine Genghis Khan in the age of smartphones. In this journey, we're unlocking time itself, revealing how old these iconic figures would be if they were still alive now, and how their stories still shape our world. At 136, Hitler would be a ghost of tyranny, his legacy a chilling reminder of how one man's hatred reshaped the fate of millions. If Washington were alive today, he'd witness a world shaped by freedom, but tangled in the very complexities he warned us about nearly 300 years ago. At 382, Newton would see his theories launching rockets and exploring black holes, proof that one curious mind can move the universe. Had Mother Teresa lived to 115, her message of compassion would still echo louder than any war or wealth in today's divided world. At 156, Aguinaldo would see a free Philippines, his dream turned into reality, his revolution now a history lesson for the future. If Puyi were still alive, the last emperor of China would see a nation transformed, where ancient dynasties gave way to skyscrapers and steel. At 106, Jackie Robinson's story would still inspire, proof that one player breaking the rules can change the entire game. Had Che Guevara reached 97, he might wonder if today's revolutions still fight for the people or just the power. At 140, Patton's battlefield tactics would be studied in classrooms, while drones and cyber wars replaced tanks and trenches. If Fidel Castro were 99, he'd see a Cuba slowly shifting, caught between the revolution he started and the change he tried to stop. At 190, Leopold II's name still echoes with infamy, his empire built on brutality, a haunting legacy carved into Congo's past. If Beethoven were alive at 255, he'd hear his music played in every corner of the world, timeless notes from a soul that never went silent. At 207, Frederick Douglass would see voices rising louder than ever, proof that his fight for freedom still fuels generations today. Had Santa Cruz reached 233, he'd witness Bolivia and Peru walking paths he once tried to unite under one dream of Andean strength. At 105, Mujib would see a Bangladesh born from his vision, resilient, proud, and still fighting to honor his unfinished mission. If Sadat were alive at 107, he'd see the Middle East still wrestling with peace, his bold steps remembered, his courage still debated. At 167, Teddy Roosevelt's rough-riding spirit would still challenge today's leaders to speak softly but carry a moral big stick. At 276, Goethe's words would still stir minds, proof that genius, when rooted in truth, outlives centuries with ease. If Magellan somehow reached 545, he'd see a world he once circled now connected in seconds, his voyages turned into GPS trails. At 250, Jane Austen's wit and wisdom would still charm millions, her stories of hearts and manners forever fresh, forever real. Had Queen Elizabeth I lived to 492, she'd witness a modern monarchy shaped by her iron will and golden legacy. At 178, Edison's light would still shine bright, his inventions now powering a world he could only dream of. If Lenin were 155 today, he'd see the world still debating revolution, his ideas reborn, rebranded, yet forever controversial. At 85, Micombero would reflect on a Burundi he once ruled with force, his legacy still stirring debates in African history. At 296, Catherine the Great's influence would still echo through empires, her vision of power and enlightenment still studied today. If Genghis Khan lived to 863, he'd watch a world shaped by the borders he once shattered and the fear his name still commands. At 100, Malcolm X's voice would still thunder through time, a call for justice that refuses to be silenced by age or history. Had Descartes reached 429, he'd find a digital world built on logic, still asking the same question: what does it truly mean to exist? At 151, Shackleton's name would still stand for courage. His frozen journey, a symbol of what it means to never give up. If Jefferson were alive at 282, he'd see a democracy still evolving, built on ideals he once wrote with a pen that shook a king. At 242, Bolivar would see the South America he dreamed of, divided, united, and still calling him El Libertador. Had Churchill reached 151, he might smile at a world still quoting his words, spoken in the darkest hour, now echoing in peace. At 540, Cortez would face a world that questions conquest, his name forever linked to gold, glory, and a fallen empire. If Somoza had lived to 100, Nicaragua's streets would still remember a dynasty built on power and broken by revolution. At 96, Dr. King's dream would still march on, through streets, through voices, through a world still learning what equality means. At 110, Pinochet's shadow would still loom over Chile, his rule remembered by some with fear, by others with fire. At 108, Marcos's name still sparks debate. Was he a builder of a nation, or a ruler lost in the shadow of his own regime? As Sukarno reached 124, he'd see the Indonesia he helped free, still wrestling with democracy, still echoing his fiery speeches. At 97, Idi Amin's brutal legacy would haunt Uganda, his reign remembered not for glory, but for fear and silence. If Napoleon were 256 today, his ambition would still tower, one man who redrew Europe with sheer will and steel. At 143, Vargas would see a Brazil shaped by his era, where nationalism and labor met in a leader who ruled with both heart and iron. At 167, Pankhurst's cry for women's rights would still echo, proof that one woman's fight can outlast centuries. Had Vasco da Gama lived to 565, he'd witness oceans he once conquered now connected by satellites and shipping routes. At 135, Eisenhower's calm command would still inspire general, president, and architect of a post-war world. At 104, Picasso's bizarre empire would still shock historians, a dictator who crowned himself, then fell alone. If Franklin were 319, his inventions and ideals would still light the world, proof that genius truly never dies. At 169, Tesla's dreams would look real, his visions of free energy and wireless power now closer than ever. At 143, FDR's steady hand in crisis would still be admired, the leader who gave hope when the world was falling apart. If Hafez al-Assad had reached 95, he'd see a Syria still scarred by the dynasty he began and the wars that followed. At 133, Roxas would watch a Philippines still navigating democracy, his brief leadership etched into the nation's turning point. If Gandhi were 156 today, his message of peace would still ring louder than any war, truth and nonviolence echoing through time. At 426, Cromwell's rise from commoner to ruler would still shock, his iron rule and faith forever etched in Britain's history. Had Duvalier lived to 118, Haiti would still whisper of Papa Doc, feared by many, worshipped by some. At 542, Luther's rebellion against Rome would still thunder, one man's hammer, forever shaking the church doors of Europe. If Zengi were alive at 654, he'd see modern navies trace the sea routes he once conquered with giant sails and silent ambition. At 104, Suharto's grip on Indonesia would still stir debate, order or oppression, stability or silence. At 108, Yahya Khan's name would still echo through the scars of 1971, a general caught in a nation's unraveling. If Mandela were 107, the world would still draw strength from his story, a prisoner who rose to heal a divided land. At 124, Hirohito's reign would span from emperorship to surrender, his role still a quiet question in Japan's history. Had Kim Il-sung reached 113, North Korea's isolation would still be rooted in his vision, a dynasty built on defiance. At 483, Akbar's empire would remain a symbol of tolerance and grandeur, where power met pluralism under one crown. If Darwin were 216, he'd marvel at evolution's journey, from the Galapagos to genetic code, his theories still evolving. At 133, Franco's shadow still lingers over Spain, his rule remembered with both nostalgia and fear. If Marilyn were 99 today, she'd still dazzle the world, not just as a star, but as a symbol of beauty and broken dreams. If Queen Victoria were alive at 205, she might still be ruling with a steely gaze and unmatched poise, reminding the world why her name defined an entire era. At 213, Charles Dickens would probably still be crafting characters that expose the harsh realities of life, using his pen to stir hearts and awaken social conscience. At a staggering 534 years, King Henry VIII would no doubt still be shaking up the monarchy, divorcing laws, breaking traditions, and demanding loyalty with a thunderous roar. At 207, Karl Marx would likely be watching modern capitalism unfold with an intense glare, ready to rewrite his manifesto for a new generation seeking revolution. If Immanuel Kant had reached 301, his deep, reasoned thoughts would still be guiding philosophical debates, making humanity question morality, freedom, and truth itself. At 216, Abraham Lincoln's towering presence would still symbolize hope, unity, and the relentless pursuit of justice in a world divided by ideology. With 387 candles on his cake, the Sun King would still demand the spotlight, turning every palace into a stage and every decree into a work of theatrical art. At 238, Shaka Zulu's legacy as a brilliant warrior and strategist would still command respect across Africa, echoing through the lands he once united and defended. If Kim Jong-il were still around at 84, his eccentric rule and larger-than-life persona would continue to intrigue and unsettle the global political stage. At 393, John Locke would likely still be challenging governments, insisting that freedom, property, and reason are the cornerstones of any just society. At 108, JFK's charisma and vision would still be inspiring nations to dream bigger, act boldly, and reach for the stars, literally and figuratively. If Mao Zedong were alive at 132, his revolutionary fervor might still be shaking the foundations of power, stirring debates about progress, ideology, and control. At 146, Stalin's iron-fisted rule would remain one of the most chilling case studies in leadership, where fear, loyalty, and propaganda walked hand in hand. At 118, Frida Kahlo would still be painting her pain and passion onto canvas, her vivid self-portraits echoing with defiance, beauty, and unfiltered truth. If Mark Twain were still writing at 190, his sharp humor and fearless commentary would be the perfect antidote to the madness of the modern world. At 107, Nasser would still be standing tall in the Arab world, rallying the people with his fierce nationalism and dreams of unity and independence. If Khomeini were alive at 123, his revolutionary voice would still echo through Iran's corridors of power, shaping the country's destiny with faith and fire. At 574, Columbus would still be sailing through history books, celebrated by some, criticized by others, yet undeniably a symbol of bold exploration. At 145, General MacArthur would still be striding across battlefields, real or symbolic, with that iconic pipe in his mouth, never retreating, always returning. At 155, Primo de Rivera might still be pacing palace halls, torn between dreams of reform and the shadows of authoritarianism, forever etched into Spain's complex history. If Bach were alive at 340, his celestial harmonies would still be flowing through cathedrals and concert halls, reminding humanity that music is a language older than words. At 136, Charlie Chaplin would still be making the world laugh and cry without ever uttering a word, his silent genius echoing louder than any soundstage could contain. At 135, King Idris would still be remembered as the monarch who ruled Libya through its transformation and turbulence, his crown weighed down by both tradition and upheaval. At 203, Louis Pasteur would be hailed as the eternal guardian of science and health, the man whose microscope changed the course of medicine and saved millions of lives. At 146, Einstein's wild hair and wilder theories would still be bending time and space in classrooms and laboratories, where minds try and often fail to match his brilliance. If Rosa Parks were 112 today, she'd still be sitting boldly in defiance, a quiet revolutionary whose refusal to give up her seat sparked a movement that shook a nation. At 80, Bob Marley's reggae rhythms would still be carrying messages of peace, love, and rebellion, strumming through the hearts of generations across the globe. At a staggering 771, Marco Polo's legacy would still ride the Silk Road, whispering tales of distant lands and cultures long before the world was ever considered connected. Time moves on, but the stories of these icons continue to echo across centuries. They shaped revolutions, rewrote science, inspired millions. Though they're long gone, their presence reminds us of one timeless truth: greatness doesn't age, it echoes. Thank you for traveling through time with us. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more journeys into the past that still shape our present.